Well, welcome everyone to this roundtable discussion on caste in the South Asian diaspora. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to congratulate the organisers of this symposium, Nisha and Mridula, for putting together such a wonderful program on such an important topic, and Felix Pal as well organised a really fantastic ECR masterclass. We're finishing the day today with a roundtable discussion on caste in the Australian diaspora, with 4 speakers who will be reflecting on their work on caste and on the submission prepared by 2 of the speakers, Nisha and Vikrant, in consultation with others, on having caste discrimination recognised in the Australian Human Rights Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers for this roundtable. Dr. Vikrant Kishore is a filmmaker and academic. He has worked with Deakin University, RMIT and the University of Newcastle and is currently an independent researcher. Vikrant's areas of research are Indian cinema, intangible cultural heritage, reality television programs and caste issues, and he will be reflecting on caste discrimination and anti-caste activism in Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Priya, and thanks to all the panelists for joining us and all the audience as well. And before I start, I would also like to recognize the various traditional lands where we are located and acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. And I pay my respects to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also acknowledge and pay my respect to the struggles and rights of the Dalits, Adivasis, and the marginalized. So today, I'll briefly discuss how we went about our submission to the AHRC, the Australian Human Rights Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework, to consider including caste discrimination. Thereafter, I'll introduce my current creative work on resisting caste in the Australian South Asian diaspora and discuss the initial findings. I'll provide my perspective of how anti-caste activism is shaping up in Australia and how discussions around anti-casteism evoke strong opposition by the privileged caste mostly. I'll end up the deliberation with an assessment of the discriminatory casteist attitudes and practices in online and offline South Asian Australian community spaces, and why it is important to include caste within the equality, inclusivity, and diversity framework. Of course, there's lots of things to talk, so I'll try to be as quick as possible because I have a whole lot of things to cover. So just briefly contextualizing caste, and I'm going to use Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's assertion. Caste is a system of graded inequality and oppression. He says caste system has 2 aspects. In one of its aspects, it divides men into separate communities. In its second aspect, it places these communities in a graded order, one above the other in a social status. Each caste takes its pride and its consolation in the fact that in the scale of castes, it is above some other caste. As an outward marker of this gradation, there is also a gradation of social and religious rights, technically spoken of as Ashta Adhikara, 8 rights, and Sanskara, rites of passage. The higher the grade of a caste, the greater the number of these rights, and lower the grade, the lesser the number. Of course, it's a huge topic to talk about and all, but I'm not going to delve very much into it. But Ambedkar also adds caste is no doubt primarily the breath of the Hindus, but Hindus have fouled the air all over and everybody is infected, Sikhs, Muslims, and Christians. It is important to note that other religions of South Asia also carry the elements of caste division and casteism. Thus, with the growing South Asian population in Australia and now with the Indian diaspora almost at 1 million, we hear stories of caste biases, discrimination, and oppression on a regular basis. While the direct discrimination is rare, indirect discrimination is pervasive. If you use the Indian community as a case study, you will see a huge change in the last 2 decades, from getting together mostly under the banner of Indians or India during pre-2010s. Post-2010s, there is a huge rise of caste and religion-based groups and organizations. So if you look at, Facebook and just search caste groups, you'll see something like Australia Bharata Brahman Samajam, Gujarati Brahman Samaj, Rajput Samaj, Rajput Association Inc., United Rajput Association of Australia, Kayast Vansh International Australia, Liuva Patel Samaj Australia, and many other caste groups that they have come and strictly entry on the basis of caste in these groups. All right, so what you find is that the privileged dominant caste groups of South Asian diaspora have created social and professional networks and institutions that exclude caste oppressed Australians across multiple institutions, be it educational, religious, social, cultural, or workplace. The impact of caste can be seen in the pattern of immigration, labor issues, access to housing and other services. So, and caste inequalities, furthers the domestic violence. So if there are, intercaste marriage, caste also comes into that. So education, personal relationship, everything, caste has its own shadow. Casteist slurs and abuse, physical assaults, these are something which was earlier unheard of. Now it is making its presence felt here in Australia. Thus, the work that has been done by various anti-caste activists and organizations, especially in the UK and US, for us has been inspiring. I commend them for the work that they are continuously doing and helping others across the world to raise their voice in a thought out, understood, and a well-argued manner. Recently, the deplatforming of Thenmozhi Soundararajan, the director of Equality Labs from Alphabet/Google America to speak on caste equity in workplace, and the resignation of Google's Tanuja Gupta in protest of this deplatforming and muzzling of anti-caste discussion in Google has left anti-caste activists across the globe aghast, seeing how the casteist disinformation at a place such as Google is rampant, and subsequently no tangible attempt is made to address this. Many are battling this kind of caste disinformation or whitewashing of casteism run by the privileged caste groups. In 2020, the horrific gang rape and murder of a 19-year-old Dalit girl from Hathras, India brought many of us in Australia together to raise our concerns and share our pain. On Sunday, October 4th, 2020, we organized an online solidarity gathering that saw the participation of more than 50 people. Many shared their outrage on what was happening in India, but most importantly, they also shared their distress on growing caste divide in Australia. And a few were strong enough to discuss how they were discriminated on the basis of caste in Australia. Since then, a few caste activists have been working towards bringing the issue of caste discrimination to the mainstream and make it an integral part of the equality, inclusivity, and diversity issue in Australia. I would acknowledge the work done by Dr. Harun Qasim, who was the main person who initiated that discussion regarding AHRC submission. In fact, last year, at the beginning of 2021. Harun networked with various organizations and experts to collaborate and work on the AHRC submission. The Ambedkar International Mission, the Humanism Project, Hindus for Human Rights, South Asians for Inclusiveness were the other groups that collaborated on this. Of course, the work done by Dr. Nisha Thapliyal in spearheading this to a final conclusion has been significant. And our other collaborators were Professor Meena Dhanda, Professor Hari Bapuji, Ms. Thenmozhi Soundararajan, Mr. Vaibhav Gaikwad, and Mudit Vyas. When we decided to put our submission to the AHRC's anti-racism framework to consider including caste discrimination, some of the global discussions on caste, rising local caste biases and discrimination, and lived experiences of the caste oppressed people, including my own, were the driving force. Thus, we not only provided a background on caste discrimination and its historical overview, but we also considered the human rights principles that should guide the AHRC framework and suggested key strategies from the rights-based approach, accountability measures, and personal stories. Dr. Nisha Thapliyal will be talking about the human rights-based approach for our submission in her presentation. So coming to my own current research work, which has a focus on caste activism in Australia, I'm working on a non-traditional research output, a web series titled Resisting Caste in the Australian South Asian Diaspora. I'm working in collaboration with Dr. Martin Potter from Deakin University on this project. And this project got a seed grant from the Deakin Motion Lab in 2021. So this series, what we are trying to do is to explore caste in Australia through the eyes of 3 women from the caste oppressed groups. It builds on our work on sentimental communities, utilizing a series of short factual stories in the form of a web series to engage marginalized voices to illustrate intimate everyday life that describes both individual and collective experiences and to create an identity. So just as caste oppression is reproduced throughout the world, so too are anti-caste solidarities taking shape in a creative form around the world. And that's what we are trying to do with this web series. And we are utilizing Arjun Appaduri's Durai's theory of global cultural flow and Ambedkar's assertion that caste goes where Indians go. This project seeks to highlight how the cultural baggage of caste practice, caste privilege, caste prejudice is becoming evident in the Indian diasporic community in Australia and along with South Asian countries as well. So the personal stories of marginalization, direct or indirect prejudices that needs to be documented, we are trying to do that. And some of the coverage in Australian mainstream news has helped bring the discussion on various public platforms. So yeah, I know I'm running out of time, but quickly, in the video interviews that I have done till now, the participants have shared their frustration regarding the practice of caste in Australian South Asian diaspora, how they see the privileged caste people flaunting their caste identity while openly mocking people from the oppressed caste groups. One common concern they noted, any discussion on caste devolves towards reservation and how anyone from the reserved category are put down as undeserving and meritless. At a recent gathering, one participant had to face a joke from a privileged caste friend that someone they know looks like a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe person. Another deep-rooted prejudiced opinion about the looks and stature of someone from the caste oppressed group. While majority of the oppressed caste people either want to steer clear of caste discussions or keep themselves de-identified, what I find heartening is that they find strength in their own community groups, celebrating the Dalit and indigenous leaders such as Ambedkar, Ashoka, Phule, Periyar, Savitri, Jhalkari Bai, Nangeli, and others, talking about caste discrimination and raising consciousness and educating each other on caste issues. They are trying to do what they can. My recent interactions with groups such as the Ravidasia community of Melbourne, the Ambedkar Mission Australia, has made one thing clear, that the caste oppressed groups do not want validity from the privileged groups. They are charting their own path, owning their space and challenging casteism in their own way. The more I navigate the South Asian community, the more I'm getting to know the diverse anti-caste groups. Yet we need many more to raise their voice against casteism and caste discrimination. One of the things that lots of people ask me, how do I become a caste ally? So anti-caste ally. To be a strong anti-caste ally, one needs to understand the history of caste discrimination, at least a little bit, and the immense damage it has caused psychologically. That coming out as a Dalit is still very problematic and takes a whole lot of courage. One needs to engage with Dalit literature, and thankfully Mridula is talking about it today, and have a clarity on the history of issues such as reservation, affirmative policy, both in the context of India and Australia. Call out casteism and casteist slurs. Share the stage, pass the mic, invite Dalits to share their perspective, acknowledge their work and their stories. So I'm just going to sign off with one final thing from our presentation to HRC. And this was in question 2. What is your vision for a more inclusive, equal, and harmonious future in Australia? And our response was, as Australia is committed to combat racism, it should also explore how it can help combat casteism, especially with the growing South Asian population in Australia. One is witnessing the issue of caste and casteism spreading its roots. This issue should be dealt with not now, not ignored. Caste must be included in the anti-racism framework to protect caste oppressed, vulnerable people against discrimination and to call Australia an inclusive country. When we talk about eliminating racism and xenophobia, we need to make an attempt to include casteism in its ambit. Thus, for us to improve diversity and inclusivity, we need to endorse talking about eliminating racism, xenophobia, and casteism. We need to understand the multicultural community closely, and especially the fault line that exists within these communities, and address those effectively. We need to be clear about the human rights issues is at the heart of casteism, and Australia must demonstrate its commitment to equality and respect for human dignity. The voice of the Dalit community members within the multicultural community must be heard and given importance. Dalit community members must be included in policy matters, especially that concerns multicultural communities. Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Nisha Thapliyal is in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle. Her current research focuses on activism and education for peace and social justice in the Indian diaspora. And Nisha will be discussing the value of a rights-based approach to resisting casteism.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Vikrant, for that inspiring opening presentation. It's been a real honor and a privilege to work with you and other community activists to prepare this submission. And I also, I think the only thing I'll add to Vikrant's overview of what led up to the submission is to just share with this audience that we were not the only group to submit. The good news is that there were multiple submissions from members of the diaspora, and hopefully all of them will be available on the AHRC website in the near future. And I haven't had a chance to read all of them myself, but I thought that would be of interest to the people who've joined us today. I want to start by remembering Baba Saheb Ambedkar as well. He gave us the language of human rights on the subcontinent when it was still in its infancy globally. And he certainly captured two core principles of, today what we call the International Legal Human Rights Framework, which is what we're talking about every time we sort of talk about the United Nations. And Baba Saheb stressed the interdependence of human rights, right? That you couldn't have one without the other. And he placed social and economic equality alongside political and civic equality, what we call first and second generation rights, those of us who sort of work in the field. And Baba Saheb was also a visionary in his understanding that democracy alone is not a guarantee for the protection of the rights of minorities. And that's a truth we're living right now. So, and that's why he attempted to build the protections into the Constitution that he did. That being said, a couple of caveats. This is by no means original research. I prepared a synthesis for the submission to the AHRC, and that's what I'm sharing with you. I was in a position to do the synthesis work because of my background in doing research on rights-based advocacy for education, women's rights, children's rights. And so that's sort of what I was able to draw on to put together some of the things that the AHRC was asking people to provide. This is certainly not definitive, what I'm going to say. Please do bear in mind that we're only 60 years into the human rights journey as a planet, and we're still sort of naming and defining rights. We're on the fifth, I think, or the sixth generation of rights, and we're certainly very far from implementing all of these lofty ideals and values. I might say that more than once. And this certainly wouldn't have been possible without the generosity of Tenmuri Soundarajan and Equality Labs. They shared a lot of the legal research that they had been doing in the US context, which also helped me get a sense of how to frame some of this for our submission. So yeah, what I'm about to share with you is very much put together with an advocacy orientation. I hope it's useful. I'm going to make a few points on each of these four themes. I'll start by talking a little bit about caste and the International Legal Human Rights Framework. I'm sure everyone in the audience knows this, but just to make sure. Then I'll talk specifically to Australia's human rights record, specifically in relation to anti-racism. And then I'll make a few quick arguments about what the human rights-based frameworks that have developed in United Nations spaces over 6 decades, why they're useful for any kind of social justice policy development as well as implementation. And I consider anti-racism policy as one example of social justice policy. And and sort of end with a couple of so what's perhaps for research and advocacy in our part of the world. So first, I should also say that I also compiled academic scholarship on casteism in our diaspora, and that actually didn't take very long. There's barely, I think I found 2 papers, to be fully honest. And we had hoped to have the author of one of those papers, Dr. Mitra Periyar, with us. He's doing groundbreaking work about caste in the Nepalese Australian diaspora, both here in Australia and then the British Gorkha communities. But Dr. Pariyar is now a full-time activist in Nepal, and they don't have, and very rightly so, we couldn't figure out how to get him to join us today. But I do recommend people also look at his work if you're interested in these questions of what it looks like in the diaspora. So yeah, caste and in the UN International Human Rights Legal Framework, I think as everyone here knows, it was first discussed during the drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but of course it didn't make it in. Thanks to 50 years of unflagging activism and advocacy by Dalit and human rights activists, we've certainly made a lot of progress since then. And caste is very much a part of UN language now, even though it isn't part of those, the big conventions and so forth, right? In 2002, discrimination based on work and descent entered the UN terminology through the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which recognized that discrimination against members of communities based on forms of social stratification, such as caste, and analogous systems of inherited status, which nullify or impair their equal enjoyment of human rights. And they went on to recommend, not only did they say that caste discrimination was a violation of international human rights law, but they urged governments to ensure that appropriate legal penalties and sanctions, including criminal sanctions, were prescribed for and applied to all persons or entities within the jurisdiction of the government. So that was in the early 2000s. The CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, has continued to play a lead role in the development of a rights-based approach to tackling this problem. I won't go into too much detail about it, but just to make, in case people here are interested, again, it's in the language, right? None of this is legal. It's not enforceable. For it to become enforceable, it needs to be translated into national law and policy. But certainly the UN does perform an important role in this whole conversation because treaty bodies like the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women and the Committee on the Rights of the Child and a few others now actively look for data on caste discrimination, right? When they're engaging with any issues of discrimination. And because they acknowledge the reality of caste discrimination, we have more data than we've ever had before. The UN works with something called periodic reviews, which are just basically reports on how governments are doing on their human rights commitments. So we are now seeing attention paid to caste in these periodic reports on governments around the world. And last but not the least, the UN appoints special rapporteurs, right, which have particular mandates to go out and look at how the whole planet is doing on a particular issue. And so, for example, we have the special rapporteur on racism, the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, the special rapporteur on minority issues, on adequate housing. I have a longer list of about 10. They all now work with the recognition that caste discrimination is a reality. So that's a little bit of good news. And of course, I have to emphasize again that the burden is still being carried primarily by civil society organizations, human rights organizations, Dalit organizations, and other organizations. They do a large part of the work of reporting on how governments are doing, because most governments are doing very little. Specifically in relation to South Asia, as most of you know, caste caste and untouchability, as Vikrant has already said, is a reality across the subcontinent, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. But only India and Nepal have taken the first steps towards developing any kind of legislation to try and change the problem. So in India, of course, we legally abolished untouchability in 1950, and Nepal did the same in 1963. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail about that. If that's what you're interested in, I strongly recommend the International Dalit Solidarity Network website. This is one of the things they do really well, and you'll find a wonderful 2022 report, which they call, they update it every couple of years. Sorry, they call it a compilation of UN references, and you will find everything I've said here, plus country-specific information for, what is it? Let me just, 20 countries, including all the South Asian countries that I just mentioned. Also, for those of you who are sort of coming at this from a global perspective, the other space to look at is, of course, this global development initiative called the Sustainable Development Goal, Sustainable Development Program. Again, thanks to the IDSN, caste governments and NGOs are being encouraged to include measures of caste discrimination when they're working on any sustainable development goal, whether it's poverty, education, violence against women, and so on and so forth, right? Because we know, as Vikrant so eloquently said, this is a form of oppression that affects every aspect of a human being's life and ability to live with dignity and respect. So that's my very quick summary of sort of what's happening at the UN level. The next bit I'm going to talk about, if I can get my slideshow to work, is what's happening in Australia. That section should be a lot shorter. So again, as I think most of you know, Australia does have human rights obligations under international law in relation to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It signed that convention in 1975. And that convention, as I just said, does recognize discrimination based on descent, including caste, and analogous systems of inherited ethnic status. But Australia is a long way from meeting its human rights obligations under international law. And of course, the best example I can give you is the treatment of First Nations peoples and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Australia was sadly one of the 4 countries that opposed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007. That's something we should never allow anyone to forget. It was in good company with 3 other settler colonies, Canada, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Turtle Island, or the United States. And it took Australia another 2 years to formally endorse that declaration, right? So, you know, when I was reading up on what prompted the whole AHRC NARF process, it was interesting to hear the Race Discrimination Commissioner Chintan say that, you know, while we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, First Nations people are still having their rights violated on a daily basis. So that was very much a stimulus for this whole process that is underway now. The second factor that Commissioner Tan pointed to was the racism against Asian migrant settlers exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic here. And then the third sort of event, a global factor that he identified was, of course, the murder of innocent Muslims in Christchurch, right? So those seem to be sort of the 3 framing events for this whole process that we're now a part of. And I think it's important to know this because it informs the ways in which we can engage with the AHRC. And it's, of course, it's important to remember that the AHRC is not the state. You might call it a part of the state apparatus, but yeah, it's just we're at the very beginnings, I think, of much needed change. Yeah, and we have to, and so as part of this whole process, the AHRC consulted with First Nations people and with multicultural organizations. And on this slide, I'm just highlighting for you what First Nations people had to say about their human rights, right, in 2021. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but just to emphasize that any struggles that we embark on must always be in solidarity with First Nations struggles for sovereignty and for their human rights, right? So that's sort of, yeah, a personal position of mine that I just wanted to speak to. Maybe I want to jump ahead there.
1 minute.
5 minutes? Yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah.
1 minute.
Just one more piece of the Australian context. In 2018, Greens Senators Lee Rhiannon and Claire Moore passed a landmark motion urging the Australian government to fight caste-based discrimination. However, this was an external-looking declaration, and they were primarily concerned with aid and humanitarian programs, and they wanted, DFAT and all the whole development industrial complex to start recognizing the realities of caste wherever they worked. And of course, if Harun was here, I hope he's going to join us at some point, he would be the first to say that Lee Rhiannon has been a great ally in this journey as well, and continues to be one for us. So now coming back to this question of, why are human rights frameworks useful to national and subnational anti-discrimination policy development and implementation? I'll do the short version because I've run out of time. But in short, we need these frameworks to move from policy on paper or symbolic policy or all these lovely value words to actual practice, right? From policy to practice. And what we've learned over the last 6 years is that we have these frameworks that have been developed at the international level, which we can draw on as activists to hold governments and other all the people who have obligations under the human rights framework, beginning with governments and government institutions and civil society. It's a very effective mechanism for assigning obligation and then holding people accountable to what we're asking them to do, right? But the first strength of a rights-based framework is that it requires strong, clear definitions of what the problem is, right? So what is racism? What does it look like? What are all the different ways it can look like, right? So, and similarly with caste, what is casteism? What does it look like in an institutional context, in an informal cultural context, in the privacy of our homes? What's the difference between visible and invisible casteism? That sort of nuance of language is what we get when we work with a rights-based framework, which then allows us to develop policy and programming that responds to each of those particular forms of oppression. And I'm sort of emphasizing this point only because as a human rights scholar, my experience has shown me how easily the language of rights can be co-opted and diluted. And the best example I can give you of that is the Right to Education Act from India, which I've studied at some length, but I won't go into that in any detail. So this table is just to sort of, we put all of this into our submission, and I'll just talk about the top row before I let you go. So, one of the best tools that, we get from the rights-based frameworks coming out of the international work is the recognition that governments are the primary duty bearers when it comes to doing something about discrimination. And what are the government's obligations? They fall into two broad categories. One, they have to acknowledge that there's a problem. Two, they have to prevent it from happening, right? And three, they have to go beyond that, from stopping discrimination, right, to do actively or proactively introducing measures for equity and justice. So in other words, recognizing that groups that have historically experienced oppression, that there's a generational impact of that, and that it falls on governments, not just governments, but beginning with governments, to introduce proactive equity and social justice measures. So, I can come back to this if people want to talk about it, but I'll just end with sort of 6 takeaways for me that might make all of this very concrete. So, in terms of the AHRC process, my understanding is we're going to have more consultations, right? So as I said, we're a long way, we're just starting the journey. But for those of us here who are asking the question, what can we do in terms of research and advocacy? Here are some quick ideas. One, we need a lot of legal expertise, right? That's what we've learned from the UK and the US, where activist comrades have, embarked on similar campaigns. We need legal capacity, we need legal knowledge to make these arguments using Australian law and existing jurisprudence, both at the federal and at the state or subnational level. 2, we need to do a lot of translation and educational work beyond the South Asian community. And I think we will find that some of this human rights language will help us translate these issues for audiences that, have no knowledge of what casteism is, or think that, it's only an Indian problem, or, just have sort of misconceptions about what we're dealing with. A third takeaway for me is, of course, that we do our own research and documentation. So everybody who has submitted to the AHRC, one of the things everybody has asked for is more data and more disaggregated data, because this is something the government doesn't do currently, right? But what I'm saying is we cannot wait for the government to do it, right? Harun, who Vikrant mentioned, has already engaged with the census authorities, and we can come back and talk to you a little bit about what they told us in the Q&A. But to say we cannot wait, we have to create our own data, just as the Anti-Caste Discrimination Alliance did in the UK in 2009 with their groundbreaking report, Hidden Apartheid, and just like Equality Labs did in the US in 2016, right? Those 2 reports are still really valuable reference points for activists everywhere. The 4th takeaway, I think is we need to study and learn from the UK and the US. We cannot do exactly what they're doing there, but there are valuable lessons to be learned in terms of how the state has responded to the claims of caste oppressed groups. And I won't say too much more about that. 5th, as I've already said, we need to build coalitions and make sure that our activism is in solidarity with other anti-racist struggles, beginning with First Nation struggles. And lastly, we need to acknowledge, name, and disrupt caste privilege in the settler colonial academy. So I'm speaking directly now to my fellow academics. This is very much a reality in our world. Vikrant and I did a webinar on this last year, which I still, which was, as someone who has Savarna privilege, there were a lot of things I learned in that conversation. So that would be my last takeaway, that we engage with caste privilege in the Australian Academy.